When I was very small and people asked me what I wanted to be, I would say I want to be a mathematician. But if they asked me what is a mathematician, I hadn't a clue. I just knew my father was a mathematician. After Courant had interviewed me, he sent me out to have lunch with everybody. They sat at the table, they discussed Siegel's lecture on the packing of spheres, and then they talked about some theater, and then they talked about something else about New York. I thought, this is a great place.
At some point, this turned into getting a thesis in your PhD. So how did that come about?
Oh, that came about by my getting pregnant. And when I told Courant that I was pregnant, he rushed off and immediately suggested a program so I'd get my PhD in 3 months. Once I got into the atmosphere around Courant, there was a very positive attitude. Courant had been the supporter of Emmy Noether back in Göttingen years before. And so the idea of a woman having a profession was certainly accepted all around the Courant Institute.
Why are there still so few women in mathematics, do you think?
The idea that you can have a profession where you want to stay up all night proving a theorem, there's some women to whom that has no appeal. Well, the other area that I really worked on was scattering theory, and that was inspired by a lecture of Joe Keller's. I was sitting there listening to Joe talk. I thought, you could look at the wave equation. In time, it's hyperbolic, and in space, it's elliptic. And then I went, after that lecture, and I started fooling around, and I came up with some crucial identities within a few days. That's the only time I ever did anything fast. But mine was quite direct, and that was that the energy, if you make a disturbance around a certain class of objects, being star-shaped, for example, is sufficient, that then the energy decays exponentially in any finite sphere. So that was the essence of the scattering theory.
Do you have a favorite piece of work of yours?
Getting estimates for the wave equation, that was sort of surprisingly easy, and so in a way it's a favorite. Well, actually, my favorite paper is a paper on exponential decay of solutions of the wave equation, where I broke it up and showed how there's a piece going out. At every instant of time, you can take out a piece. Then you go forward in time, take out another piece. And then it's very easy, actually, to expect and to prove exponential decay.
How did you become a trustee at Princeton?
They had 2 women trustees, neither of whom were professionals, and they thought they should have a woman trustee who was a professional, and they claimed they looked in the files and decided on the mother of Nancy Moravitz.
And did you feel you had a real role to play in running the university?
No.
I see.
I remember at every stage I always thought the power must lie in some level above me. But I actually was eventually in the highest level of administration that fell to the trustees, and the power didn't lie there either.
Kathleen, let me start by asking you to tell me about your early time in Ireland.
I was actually born in Canada in 1923. My father returned to Ireland in 1925 to take up a position at Trinity College Dublin, from which he had graduated some years before. I think they also awarded him during that time an SCD, so without any requirements. So he then became Dr. Singh. And so we went to Ireland in 1925. I don't remember that. I was only 2 years old. But I do remember when I started school. What happened was that my sister was older than me, was 5 years old, so she was enrolled in the kindergarten at Alexandra School, which was a major private school for Protestants in Dublin. Everything was strictly on religious lines. But I missed her because she was my playmate, and so I lay down on the floor and had a big tantrum, which was a favorite occupation of mine, actually, from time to time. And so my mother took me down to the school, and the principal said, I remember this interview because I was sitting on a chair and my feet were dangling. And she asked me if I could take myself to the bathroom. That was the main question, and I said yes, I could, and that was that. So I was enrolled in kindergarten at the age of 3, and of course kindergarten was a reasonably serious business, so I could read by the time I was 4. And I was an enthusiastic reader. I read out loud, which was a bit of a nuisance to my parents.
Was there any math or science in those early days?
When I was very small and people asked me what I wanted to be, I would say I wanted to be a mathematician. But if they asked me what is a mathematician, I hadn't a clue. I just knew my father was a mathematician. So it was just my admiration for him that made me say that.
So growing up, he didn't talk math with you?
No, not at all.
What was the rest of elementary school and high school like for you? What were you interested in before you were interested?
History. British history, Canadian history, ancient history. They alternated.
Well, let's back up to when you left Ireland then.
My father went from Ireland to Canada in 1919 and went back to Ireland in 1925, so I was 2 years old. And then he went back to Canada in 1930 when I was 7. And then in 1943, I left home and went to work in Quebec, and he went to the States and he was at Columbus, Ohio, at Ohio State.
Kathleen, I wonder if we could go back to earlier in your life. You were a child with a famous mathematician as a father. You were a female child. You decided to study scientific things as an undergraduate. How did that happen, if you can summarize it?
Oh well, I was in Toronto.
Yes.
And my father was a professor at the university. And one went to the university where one was. One didn't go away to college. And so I went to the University of Toronto. I had a scholarship and I specialized in mathematics, physics, and chemistry. At the end of my 3rd year, I decided to take some time off. And I went to Quebec, and I must admit, my father got me a job with the Inspection Board of the United Kingdom and Canada. And so I had a job. Most of the time I was measuring the speed of shells. So
inspecting shells?
Not inspecting shells. I was measuring the speed.
No, but the Board of Inspection.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. But I began to realize I'd have to go back to college.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed a year there, and then I went back and finished up. And in my last year, I took some courses in electrical engineering. And I liked those, so I thought that perhaps I should try to divert myself and become an electrical engineer. And when the time came to go to graduate school, my father was overseas with the American Army, and I wasn't able to consult him. And I was advised by Infeld and Weinstein, and they suggested I should go to MIT. I don't think it was a terribly good choice, but I followed their advice. And when I got to MIT, I went to see the chairman of the electrical engineering department. And in that first term, I tried to sort of make a switch, but it didn't really work. So
Because you weren't as interested in the subject?
No,
or?
because I got married and I wasn't going to stick around.
I see.
And then in the second term, the powers that be at MIT came down on me and said that I had not taken enough cultural subjects as an undergraduate, and I would have to make them up, and suggested that I should take economics. And I said, well, thank you very much. In that case, I'm leaving. And they backed down immediately. so I got my master's degree without taking any cultural subjects.
I see, and presumably you don't regard this as a handicap in later life.
I guess my general attitude was one would read about those things. Well, I'm sorry that I don't know a little more about economics, but it's just a fact.
I guess what I'm curious about, I don't think you've mentioned, is your father is a mathematician. You had siblings.
That's
yes?
right. We were 3 girls.
Were you all encouraged at home by your parents to be interested in science?
No. My mother was very interested in us having careers.
Mm-hmm.
It was clear that she regretted that she did not have a career. She didn't, in fact, finish college, although she finished 3 years of it. And that was unusual in her day and age. So we were encouraged, and my older sister became an architect, and which is somewhat mathematical. I enjoyed watching her design things, and sometimes thought I wish I'd gone into architecture myself. And my younger sister was very musical, but in the end she didn't have a career in it. And my father sort of felt that if he was, I think his basic attitude was if he was going to pay for our education, he actually didn't pay for much of it, that then we should do something useful. Yeah, that could be a career if our marriages didn't work out or for various things like that. Yeah.
Those sound to me like very enlightened attitudes
Well,
for a while ago. I mean,
yeah, that's true.
encouraging women to have careers?
Yeah, that's certainly true. I never thought about it at the time. And I don't know that any of the people we knew, other kids at school, were being so encouraged. But I didn't think about it. Just a fact. Don't know what's good when you have it.
When did you first start developing an interest in math?
When I was in high school, I had a very enthusiastic teacher, Mr. Reynolds, and he saw the possibility that I could get a nice, juicy scholarship to go to the University of Toronto. So I went to his coaching class after school, and he coached us in things that were just short of calculus. So we were doing kind of limits.
But you were not allowed in the regular program that was for boys only? It was
No,
it was
program? A school. It was a special school run by the university, which was for boys only. That's no longer true.
Uh-huh.
And so when I went to the University of Toronto, you went into an honors program that was completely specialized. So the first year it was math, physics, and chemistry. And the second year I took math and physics, and the third year I took math and applied math, and then the fourth year I just took applied mathematics. It was all very narrow. Each year there was one course, 1 hour a week, which was a substitute for religious knowledge. So if you went to a Catholic college within this complicated structure, or United Church College, then you took their religious knowledge. But since I was in the college that had nothing to do with religion, I took a course called Oriental Literature, which was really Bible.
So you're saying you didn't develop an interest until really late.
Oh, well, interest, no, but I was interested in getting money. And in high school, for getting into the university, Ontario gave out certain number of scholarships. And one of them, two of them, were really very attractive. They paid your tuition, and which was then about $150 a year. I got a second scholarship, which gave me some cash, so I felt pretty well off with that. But in order to take those scholarships, I had to go into math and physics. Math, physics, and chemistry.
Once you started school in Toronto and were taking the math and science classes at your fellowship,
Yeah.
is that when you first started to think of yourself as a potential mathematician?
I realized that I had to think of that, but I didn't really like the prospect very much, and the possibilities were very limited. I was a good student, but there were better students in my class. One of my fellow students was Bob Steinberg from UCLA. He was a much better student than I was. Another student was James Jenkins, who was somewhat peculiar and I think didn't really quite make it, but he had lots of mathematical brains. And they were pretty good. I used to come in around 8th or 9th in a class of about 30. And that kept my scholarship for me.
Did you work at all?
No.
In the summers, in anything?
Oh no, my father would not have allowed that. No, he considered in the summer I should study math on my own. I never did. I played tennis, bad tennis with my sister. And we used to go away in the summer. My father had a 40-foot sailboat, and we were the crew. But I loved that. I was a passionate sailor.
How did your year of studying the muzzle velocity come about?
Oh, yes, the muzzle velocity. I was in my last year of high school when the war broke out. And by the time I was in my third year of university, a great many of the young men had left college. They weren't drafted out of college, but they left and were serving in in particular, the mathematicians were serving in the Navy. They got rather interesting jobs. They were immediately made officers, no boot training for them. So I went down to the recruiting place of the Wrens, as they were called, the women, and I suggested that they should do the same for me, and they said, no, you would have to start at the bottom as a Wren and work your way up. So I didn't want to do that, but on the other hand, I had a boyfriend, and he was in the Navy, and I wanted to do something. So my father got me a job with the, what was it called? The Inspection Board of the United Kingdom and Canada. Very impressive.
This is while you were a student?
While I was a student, so I quit college at the end of my third year, and I went and I worked in Quebec at this place, and I had a very good time.
So what were you doing? Tell us about the project.
The one that I liked best was chutes of naval guns which were going to be shipped to Murmansk in the north of Russia for the Russian war effort, and they had to be tested. We were near the Laurentian Mountains, so it was the foothills of the Laurentian Mountains, and we set up these chutes with electric eyes, and you need 3 of them to measure the muzzle velocity. And they gave me a big sheepskin coat to wear and I thought it was very glamorous. Everybody else hated to go on these shoots, but I liked to go, and everybody knew that.
So you were shooting?
No, I didn't fire the gun.
Oh.
There was a chronograph which lit up lights, and you read the lights, and then you translated that into a velocity, which was a certain amount of work, but it became so automatic that it wasn't even science anymore. And the thing, though, that interested me scientifically was when their light was bad, they had to use a thing where a magnetic stick dropped and something nicked it on the side, and there was ink on it so that there was a shown nick. And then you took it and you laid it against something and measured what the muzzle velocity was from that. And I found a mistake in it. And that was my first scientific effort, was finding that mistake and pointing it out to the boss and being approved for that. So that was
First research project.
that was my first research project.
By now, were you thinking that math and science was going to be a career for you?
I knew I had to finish. I had to get my bachelor's degree. It was an honors degree, and that without it, I wouldn't get any sort of interesting work. Most of the students in Toronto that were in mathematics went into the insurance business. They became actuaries. So I looked into doing that. And when I was interviewed for that, there they told me, you will never be an actuary, you're going to be a mother and blah, 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 and not have a profession. And so I was kind of annoyed with them. And they wouldn't hire me in the actuarial department for the summer, which they would have done if I'd been a man, but they gave me a job in the bond department. So I spent my summer amortizing the bonds and sailing in the late afternoons. I found that you could make a linear approximation, which was perfectly good for a long stretch, so I could amortize hundreds of bonds with as fast as I could write it down.
Is that when you decided actuarial business was not for you?
That is absolutely true. I was sure of that.
What were your parents saying at the time?
My mother was the one who was enthusiastic about me having a career. I think she felt she would have enjoyed life more if she'd had a career. And my father, he didn't quite know how to handle it. At one point, of course, I took courses with him. This class was about 30. He'd take 6 students who sat in the front row, and those were the students to whom he addressed his questions.
Let me just make sure I get this. He was teaching at the University of Toronto.
That's right.
And you were in his class?
That's right. That happened
Several times.
Several times.
Interesting. Okay.
And so when it came my turn, I sat up among these 6 students in the front row. And now he addressed the male students by their last names and the female students as Miss So-and-so. And he came to me and he held his breath. The class was waiting expectantly. What was he going to call me? So he looks at his list and he looks at me and then he says, Miss Singh. Blah, blah, blah. So the class cracked up. Very funny.
So by that point, were you discussing mathematics at home?
No. Now, it is true that from high school on, my sister and I would both go in with problems we were stuck on to his study, and he always had paper that he had written on one side and wanted to discard, and then he would write out something. And the big feat was to catch the paper and take it with you, because I didn't remember what he had said, but I could read the paper.
Can you talk about how your career got started and took off?
Well, it started off rather bumpily because as an undergraduate in Toronto, I actually got my degree in applied mathematics. And I wanted to pursue that when I went to MIT, and I felt that I would shift over into electrical engineering. But two things turned out to put a downer on that. First was that I found that somebody required me, I've forgotten his name, he's a famous professor of electrical engineering, said I should take a lab. Well, in the lab, there was something called a klystron, and I was always plugging it in the wrong way and getting an electric shock from the outside of it. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was, turned out that you really had to do the arithmetic in the courses accurately. And my arithmetic wasn't very good, so wasn't getting very good marks. So and then I got married in the middle of that term, so then I decided to just finish up in math. So I did my thesis in elasticity, and then I came down here.
What was the position of women at MIT in those days?
Oh, that was fine.
They could be real students?
Oh, definitely. And in fact, MIT had admitted women from the very beginning, which was a little late in the 19th century. And they had a suite of rooms for the women students to meet each other, and well, it was okay. Mind you, it was basically a rather lonely place, so this was better, but it wasn't really. I kept a few friends from there, but not many.
After Toronto,
Yeah.
how did you decide what your next move is going to be?
Well, of course, I went down to Quebec at the end of my third year, and I was there for about 15 months. And my parents moved to the States. My father went to Columbus, Ohio. And so I came back and I spent my last year in the dorm. I had a wonderful time. It was very different from living at home. And then there was a woman mathematician at Toronto who had always taken an interest in me and my sister. And she met me one day crossing the campus, and she asked me what I was planning to do the following year after I graduated. And I said I was thinking of going to India as a teacher. She threw her hands in the air, and she set about changing that. And she changed it because she immediately got me a fellowship to go anywhere I wanted to go in the States, a Canadian Junior Women's Fellowship. And then I applied to MIT, and they gave me also a tuition, so I could go for free to MIT. I started at MIT in June, I guess, right after graduating. And and Herbert came to see me in August, and we got married in November, much to the sorrow of the lady who had gotten me this fellowship. But we worked that out. It was perfect. I didn't cheat on them. After finishing my master's degree, I moved to where Herbert worked, which was in New Jersey. That Christmas, Courant and my father met each other at the Math Society meeting, which they often had. They knew each other. And they talked about their daughters who were in science. And Courant said to my father, well, my daughter is in biology and you can do nothing for her, but perhaps I can help your daughter. Send her to see me. So I went to see him, and he didn't offer me a job on the spot, but he said there were things I could do. And so I arranged I thought it was an enormous thing to commute. Nowadays, one wouldn't feel that way. It took me about an hour and a quarter from door to door. We lived in New Jersey, and I had to take the Jersey Central and then the ferry and then the subway to get to the office. But I did that quite happily. I used to work on the way there and back. And I was given the job of editing Supersonic Flow and Shockwaves. And that's how I learned it.
You got your master's at MIT.
Yeah.
And then moved to New Jersey where Herbert had a job.
Yeah, the Bakelite. Yeah.
That's when you first met with Courant, that your father had set up this meeting for you
That's
to go
right.
see Courant.
Well, I had an interview with him earlier, yeah.
You said the first meeting he didn't actually offer you a job right away. So when did that happen?
Courant was always very imprecise, and I just assumed I'd get a job with him. I wasn't worried about that.
And then when he said to you, could you edit?
Yeah.
Isn't that unusual for a big project like that? Did you know anything about Shockwaves?
No,
at that
nothing
time?
at all. That's how I learned it. There were lots of people who were sort of working on it. I mean, there were great parts of it that had to be rewritten. And now there were other people who, or even the same people, who were also working on a new edition of, an English edition of Courant Hilbert. But I was never involved in that.
How long were you working on the Shockwave book?
I got my degree in '50, but I had left at the end of the term in '49, I think. My thesis was on spherical shocks, so it came right out of the end. Gödelai's Solutions, the last chapter in the book. Yeah.
Whoa, it still seems like a big project to give a grad student who didn't.
Well,
Did you find any mistakes?
there were plenty of mistakes in English, although the remarkable thing is that Courant, who was considerably older than Friedrichs, had a wonderful feeling for the English language. He could phrase things, whereas Friedrichs was somewhat pedantic and Prussian in his outlook, and so his English was too tight, not quite good.
Did you have to argue with them to accept your edits?
Friedrichs would argue with you about anything. I usually ended up saying, it's not the way you do it in English, or something like that, and then he accepted that. My father met Courant at a meeting, and Courant's daughter, Gertrude, who later became a good friend of mine, had just gotten married. So they commiserated together about their professional daughters giving up their careers. And Courant told my father to send me to see him. So I went to see Courant. I was quite charmed, and I liked the atmosphere. And he sent me out to have lunch with a gang of students, and they were wonderful. They were talking about all sorts of things. Siegel had just given a lecture, and they were excited about that, packing of spheres, or packing of something. And I thought they were just great. So I was very happy. I had to commute a long way. We lived in New Jersey near Plainfield, so I had to come all the way into New York. But I did it. I did it, I think, 3 days a week.
A lot of people don't know the history of what is now called the Courant Institute.
Oh, yeah. No, Courant was in the building that's next to the Judson Church, occupied the whole building, and there were about 10 to 15 students who had positions with Courant. He supported them mainly on a Navy grant, I think. And then there were, of course, other students who came in. I think Harold Bradford, for example, was one who worked in the somewhere in New Jersey and came to work here.
So these were real PhD students that you
Yeah,
went
they
to
were-
lunch with.
That's right.
Ah, I
Yeah,
see. Okay.
yeah.
So after the momentous lunch,
Yes.
you said to Courant, I want to continue here, or what was the next step? It sounds very informal compared to today.
It was very informal. I don't know how it came up, but I said I only wanted to work part-time, and he said that was fine. And we agreed that I would work, I think it was 3 days a week.
This is as a student.
And I was a student, but I was working on something. I worked on the Courant Friedrich's book. That started right away.
Right, well, this is something that many people find fascinating, that as a graduate student, you were involved in the very famous Courant Friedrichs book and entrusted with what was apparently a major mathematical project
Well, Courant's
as a PhD student.
Well, Courant's attitude was that English was my native language.
Yes, okay.
Therefore, and I used to go into Friedrichs and he would argue with me about some sentence or other that he wanted in some fashion, and I would say, no, it's not English, and they just accepted that. And they definitely had the attitude that I came from Canada and I spoke English.
And so did the sort of knowledge that you picked up from editing that book and in general then lead to your subsequent graduate work?
Oh, yes.
How did that happen? Because you were part-time.
There were parts of the book where I had to check the accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I learned those parts.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard of a shockwave before I read the book.
Really? I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was your first impression of Courant when you first?
I met him in an interview, and that interview appeared in some movie about Courant. And I had my coat on, and I was nervously twisting a button on it. And the button came off and rolled under the table, and Courant and I both got down and found the button, and that was that. However, in the way the movie went, it sounded like something had happened under the desk, but nothing happened.
Are you trying to say he was a regular person?
I had experienced slight sexual harassment while I was a student at Toronto. I never experienced any of that at NYU.
Well, how about when you first came as a student and met the other students? What was your first impression of the Institute?
After Courant had interviewed me, he sent me out to have lunch with everybody. So there were about 10 people. Louis may have been there. And I thought they were wonderful because they sat at the table, they discussed Siegel's lecture on the packing of spheres, and then they talked about some theater, and then they talked about something else about New York. I thought, this is a great place.
At some point,
Yeah.
this turned into getting a thesis and your PhD. So how did that come about?
Oh, that came about by my getting pregnant. And when I told Courant that I was pregnant, he rushed off and immediately suggested a program so I'd get my PhD in 3 months or something like that.
Really?
Yeah. And I wasn't going to do that. And my defender was Flanders. His brother was the senator from Vermont, a very honorable man who turned on McCarthy. But Flanders was well, you might have thought he was a Quaker. He actually wasn't a religious man, but he had all the kind of considerations that a Quaker has. And I enjoyed his, he was a poor teacher and suffered from that, but he was a wonderful influence on people. And So I went to Flanders and said, I can't do all those things that Courant wants me to do. So Flanders said, don't worry about it, and he fixed it all up.
Then what happened? Instead of getting your PhD in 3 months,
That's right. I went ahead. I had my baby, and that was Pegeen, and we lived in New Jersey. And after 6 weeks, I went back to class, and after a few months, I went back to working.
The Courant Institute today is world famous,
Yeah.
and people assume it's always been here as the Courant Institute.
Yeah.
But actually, that's not true at all.
No. Well, Courant was here, and Courant and Stoker were negotiating with the Sloan Foundation. They were very anxious to do something to honor Warren Weaver. I don't really know the inside story, but people were uneasy at my level, so junior faculty. They were very uneasy that the institute was going to be renamed the Warren Weaver Institute. At that time, it was called the Institute for Mathematics and Mechanics.
And
That was
Courant was still here, still in charge?
Well, I'm not sure that he was still in charge.
Okay.
Maybe Stoker had succeeded him. And so there was a move to change the name of the institute to the Courant Institute before we moved into this building,
A move by the faculty.
the faculty,
Mm-hmm.
and that took place. And the compromise was that they named the building, so you see the name of Warren Weaver on the building.
Did Courant feel
Oh, there's a very nice picture of Courant standing at the front steps after the building was made.
so he was happy with the
Oh, he
way
was
it had evolved?
Yeah, I think so.
You had mentioned that you were brought in by Courant to a meeting where there were people from the Navy and asked who supported your work.
Yes.
You've also said that there was Navy funding in the early days.
Yeah.
I think many people feel that the funding from the Navy was what allowed such wonderful mathematics to flourish.
I heard this story from Minna Reese. There was some admiral in the Navy who thought it would be very good to develop applied mathematics and who was behind the support of the Courant Institute through Minna Reese. So, and she rose in position and so on, but that was extremely important. That covered until the time when we got the computer, the big computer, and the idea that the big computer should come here. I think Courant worked on getting it, but the big person who did that was von Neumann, who had known Courant for all his career. And so once we got the big computer, then we had money, and they did some big hiring, and that made a huge, that was sort of a big expansion.
And Courant's connections with the Navy were essential, I take it, from the beginning.
Yes, yes. There's a story. He knew Warren Weaver, and Warren Weaver was on some committee in Washington, and they interviewed Courant. There were stories about that interview.
Such as?
Well, that they called him Dick, which he was never called. That was the main story. And that's how it sort of began.
Were they interviewing him about possibly funding?
him, yeah.
I
They were
see.
interviewing him about funding him. So then he got the funds, and that started this small group.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of people who got groups going. My father had a group at Carnegie. And when the war ended, they wanted to be rid of all that.
The people who had received the funding.
They didn't want to be funded by the Defense Department. But Courant felt quite differently. And so he kept on. They gave up, and there was more money.
He felt differently because
I don't know. He saw an opportunity to build up something that way. That's the main.
And the military were willing, the Navy
Oh
was
yeah,
willing.
no, and I don't know who that admiral was, but it was somebody who sponsored Minna Reese.
It's just interesting to me because today funding is full of things like regular reports, milestones, goals, deliverables, and people often yearn for the days when the agencies just said, "You're doing very good work."
Yeah, well,
Here's
there
some
were
money.
reports because
Of
I
course.
did write a fair
Right.
number of those.
Well, yes, but
Yeah.
it sounds to me as though the main view was we want to support good applied
Yes.
mathematics.
Yeah, no, that was the main
Yes,
view.
yes.
Very important.
One thing that strikes me about you in particular is you've had a marriage and you've had 4 children, and you've combined it with an extraordinary career in mathematics. A pressure many women feel is that they can't have a family and have a career in sciences, particularly.
Well, there was, of course, a case of Grace Chisholm, who was really the preceding generation. So she had a big career. And that idea also goes through her grandchildren, I think. But I didn't know anything about her. I never heard of her until much later.
It seems to me from what you said that one of the features was that you were allowed to work part-time, which is harder.
That was extremely important. Very, very important.
It sounds in a way as if it was essential.
I would say it certainly was essential. And of course, what happened is, really, when it came to around the third child or so, Courant got proud of me. And I think that played a big role too.
Proud of you in the sense that
I was able to do all these things together.
many people find it remarkable that you were able to do all those things.
Well, he was tremendous help. You know, I could just cut my own ticket. I mean, write my own ticket. I could work as many days as I wanted to.
So it was Richard Courant's very enlightened attitudes that contributed greatly to your
definitely,
success.
Definitely.
Yes,
Yeah,
well,
very much so.
I think he judged well.
I think he helped a number of other people too, and other women.
Well, as I say, it's an issue that you've cared about and talked about,
Yeah,
and that's not resolved, whatever that means, yet.
that's right.
So,
Well, it's much more resolved than it was.
yes, that's true.
I mean, there were people who came and told me I was destroying my children. It's remarkable how free people felt to say awful things.
This was your colleagues or people
One of
you
my
met
colleagues or the colleagues' wives.
that you were destroying your children?
Yeah.
And how did you respond?
I ignored it.
I see.
How was that? To, young baby at home,
Yeah.
back to school, graduate school, research.
I liked the atmosphere so much, so I was I wasn't unhappy in that. I had a little bit of postnatal depression, but just nothing much.
And was there any reaction to you having a baby and going back to work?
Oh, sure. Who was it? Yes. The Flanders invited us one evening, and Mrs. Flanders disapproved. And when I arrived at their house, she thrust into my hand a book called Babies Are Human Beings, or something like that. So I was pretty annoyed about that. And in fact, I was upset about it. That upset me. But I gave Flanders the book and said, take it back. I wasn't going to put up with that.
Even today, people talk about should you have your kids in
Before,
grad school, before tenure, after tenure? It's a problem.
Well, I think you have to do whatever suits you. I was much influenced by the wife of Henry Primakoff, Mildred Cohn, who became a very, very famous woman in some biological field. And I met her early on at a party. Her husband was working with Courant and Henry Primakoff. And I met her again when I was back at MIT. They lived near us, and she was a good example. She had 4 children. That was all older than me. I liked her as an example. Many years later, when I had 4 children, one of my colleagues, who shall remain nameless, came into my office one day and sat down opposite me and laid into me and how terrible it would be and how badly my children would grow up and how they would be all very disappointing and I don't know what all. And I just listened to him and I said, I don't believe it or something like that. And he left. And of course, the children turned out very well.
And there was no problem in your relationship with these nameless colleagues?
Well, that was the only time anybody said anything where I would have liked to take a big smack at them. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because 30 years later,
Yeah.
it sounds like I had more trouble at Courant than you
Could
did.
be. Could well be. Yeah.
Why are there still so few women in mathematics, do you think?
Well, it's possible that they're less gifted, but I don't know. They may just simply get distracted. Or they don't have that single-mindedness. Some of them do. I mean, Julia Robinson was as single-minded as you could ask for. The idea that you can have a profession where you want to stay up all night proving a theorem, there's some women to whom that has no appeal. I think that plays a role.
When did you start seeing yourself as someone who
Like
wanted to
that.
stay up all night and finish proving some
Oh,
theorem?
in my first year at NYU. The war had ended, Friedrich wanted to do something different, and he decided to teach a course in topology. Well, the truth was it was really, for me, a course in advanced calculus, which I had never had. And I worked very hard on the problems, shed a few tears over some of them in private, and got immersed in the idea of learning mathematics.
I have to ask a little more. You just suggested a few theories about why there's fewer women. But how would you ever tell? Are they less talented? Are they less interested when socialization starts immediately?
Well, I think it's very hard. I don't think you can tell. And besides, it's the outcome that matters. There are many people, non-mathematicians, who will say that an awful lot of mathematicians have Asperger's syndrome. You know? Well, to be a woman and to have that label is far worse than to be a man and to have that label. I don't know. That's part of our socialization or the way things work. And there was a woman student at NYU who was very brilliant. It's a long time ago and it's hard for me to quite remember. I think she eventually dropped out, but she was definitely very smart and also very removed from society. So it happens. I don't know why.
Do you have any particular suggestions, things that you think
Might help women.
should be done, could be done to help?
I really don't know. I don't have any specific suggestions.
What advice would you have for a high school girl who was interested in mathematics and wanted to pursue a career?
Well, first of all, she has to have some measure of her talent because it's a very competitive area, and if she's not good at it, there's no point in struggling with that. And usually the best measure of that would be how she does on competitive exams, or what some teachers think of her. That's also important. Now, I had one daughter who was very gifted in mathematics. She was a student at MIT. Her math professors thought very highly of her, and then suddenly she announced she was going to go into medicine. So she had to take organic chemistry and all these other things, and but it didn't set her back. She was very efficient and made the transfer, and she became a psychoanalytic psychiatrist, which is really a long way from being a mathematician. And it was a loss to mathematics, but I couldn't even express any sadness about it. I didn't want to upset her. You can look at this particular case and ask, why was it? And of course, there will be people who will say, and maybe true, it may not be true, that on the whole, among women, women are more interested in things that have this sort of mental health connotation. Can't tell.
Mm-hmm.
Can't tell.
The more socializing aspects of scientific fields.
Yeah.
Well, I worry that there's not as much time these days to blossom into mathematics. For example, you discovered it late.
I was a very good math student in high school, and we had a teacher who, in the last year, took a group of 8 or 9 students and coached them to learn to do well on the tests that got you into university and gave you money.
Right, but you liked history. You didn't really like math until you got to college. So you were good at it.
No, I was good at it, but I liked this teacher, and I liked his style and so on. And I learned about limits from him. I liked that.
Well, that's another thing they say, is a good teacher.
Yeah, he was a very good teacher.
Is instrumental in encouraging interest as well.
He had lost an eye in the First World War, and he had a glass eye. And the students were always somewhat worried as to whether he was really looking at them or was he really looking somewhere else. And he ran this special class, and I got this nice scholarships, but some of the other people also got lesser scholarships, but it really helped. And he worked several days a week till 5 o'clock in order to do that.
So you found encouragement at various
that's right.
important points along the way. Yeah. Any other advice for
women?
Women today?
Well, there used to be a saying when I was young, don't get your shirt in a knot. And
we're talking about shirts, pink shirts and now knotted shirts.
That's right. So I think that's take it as it comes along. Yeah. I think the hardest periods in my life were connected to the natural depression you have about a month or so after you've had a child, and sometimes that was tough. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's something. When I was in that state, nobody sort of mentioned it. It was brushed under. But nowadays, every book tells a woman this, although I'm not sure that makes it really easier.
Yeah, just a tough period.
Tough period, yeah.
How about advice for math departments? Why are there so few women that they hire?
Maybe that has something to do with the social characteristics of the men. I don't know.
That's what I think.
Well, I certainly found in the different places where I was that Courant's outfit was the best.
They were certainly ahead of their time in having women and not just the women students in you becoming the director.
Well, but if you go back, I mean, Courant was very supportive of Emmy Noether. And then there's a famous saying that Hilbert said, that it's not a bathing place. I think it was in connection with hiring Emmy Noether.
It's not a bathing place now?
It's not, the math department is not a bathing place. You're not selecting the women, or only men and so on.
Oh.
I haven't got the right quotation. Yeah. Well, I think that's in Courant, in the book about Hilbert.
You were a real pioneer, and it was great for me to have the office next to you.
Well, thank you. I miss you.
Back to you getting your PhD completed. You had your baby.
Well, at that point, when I had the second baby, Herbert was also getting his PhD. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, and I got kind of depressed then. I thought I wasn't going to be able to do it. But eventually, I think what happened actually then was Herbert spoke to the wife of one of my colleagues, and the wife spoke to her husband, and he spoke to Friedrichs, and they all agreed that I should get my degree and get out of there. So I did.
What happened then?
Well, then Herbert got a postdoc at the Harvard Medical School. We went to Boston, and I interviewed for 2 jobs. One was at Friedrichs' suggestion, which was to work for Stefan Bergman, who worked for von Mises at Harvard, and the other was to work for C.C. Lin, whom I had actually met in Toronto. He worked for my father for a while. And, the interview with Bergman and von Mises was terrible. I had a bad sore throat and could barely speak, and it was, I didn't feel I was making any impression on them. And von Mises used the occasion to sort of tease Bergman. So, I was fed up. I didn't want to work for these guys. And so then when C.C. Lin offered me a job, I jumped at it. That was at MIT, and he had a grant from NASA. It had some other name then. And I worked on, from that I got my first 2 published papers. They were on stability problems for ordinary differential equations with turning points. Like the model is a Bessel function. When you go around, it changes its asymptotic behavior. So, and at the time that I came there, Wolfgang Vaso was also there for half a year, and I got lots of ideas from him, and we worked together. We didn't publish anything together, but that was a good contact, and I enjoyed it. Lin I didn't see so much of because his wife was very sick, and she recovered, but that was later.
So how long did you stay?
A year in the summer, I guess. Well, maybe the summer we went somewhere else, I can't remember.
And then
We came back. No, actually, the big thing was that Courant had told me when I was finishing my PhD that he would not have a position for me in the future. That was the way, if you got your degree, then you were supposed to go off somewhere else. He wasn't going to give permanent jobs to all his graduate students. So I didn't take that amiss in any way. But then Actually, what happened was there was a Congress. The first Congress after the war was held in Cambridge, and they were operating a nursery school. So I had my two kids were in a nursery school, and I was able to attend the Congress. And in the course of time, I had a party in our very modest apartment, which consisted of 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, and that was it, and a bathroom. No living room, nothing like that. And I had this party there, and Courant was so impressed by that, he offered me a job if I came back to New York afterwards.
Well,
And so I think he always had the idea that I was wasted on mathematics and I should really run a salon.
well, this could be foreshadowing for your administrative work later.
Yeah, I think it was.
That was your reintroduction back to New York City?
Well, that was it, all in Boston, and then when that ended, and then Courant came to that Congress, and after the Congress, he said, well, if I were to come back, he'd be very happy to offer me a job. So that was fine by me. So I had a nice prospect.
This was a job that was for research.
It wasn't for teaching, yeah. And most of Courant's, he ran it that way. There were lots of research associates who didn't teach. And then later on, I taught some, but I never taught a full load. I was taken care of by some research project.
So you were working part-time for the first few years of your kids, or by the time you came back to Courant, you were full-time?
As a part-time worker, I would have no benefits. So Nancy Stoker didn't like that. She thought that was very unfair. So somehow I ended up being labeled in some books as part-time and in other books as full-time. So I got my benefits. So I got my contribution to my TAA CREF began after my return.
Kathleen, how did you become a faculty member at Courant?
When Nancy, my youngest child, was about 4 years old, it was clear that Courant was no longer going to be the director and that Stoker would succeed him. And I wasn't quite sure how that would work out. And so I went to Courant and I asked to be made a faculty member. And so I think I was made an assistant professor and on a part-time basis.
Well, let me ask you now, in your early work, your famous results on transonic flow and how a shock-free airfoil is an isolated point. How did you start studying that problem?
When I went back to NYU from Boston, Lippmann Bears was there. He had come from Brown, and he was very enthusiastic. He supported women as professionals. He had many women students, and women postdocs too, and I really worked on problems more or less suggested to him. Actually, the first mixed problem I worked on, however, was connected to the work of Frankel, who I had one paper by Frankel, and it's an amazing story. Frankel was an Austrian Jew who was also, I think, a communist. So instead of going west when trouble came in the 30s, he went east, and he went to Russia. But he wasn't liked, and he couldn't get a regular position, and finally he disappeared. And I was interested in his problem, so I followed him as far as he went. And it's still not known, I think. I gave up trying to find out what had happened to him. It could be they just got rid of him. And those were the times. And So then I got, but that started me working on mixed equations, and that problem came from Friedrichs, not Beers. But then Beers came and he gave lectures, and we had big lunches, and he was very much looking after the women students and helping them. And there are many mature women and mathematicians around New York City now who owe their careers to Beers. And so I started working on more problems in mixed equations with Beers. I mean, we didn't ever write a paper together, but I was very much influenced by him.
Did you start off thinking that the shock-free airfoils were stable, or you started off thinking they were unstable?
It took me some time to formulate the problem as a boundary value problem so that you could even raise that question. And by that time I was heavily immersed in the subject, and I couldn't make such a differentiation. No, not really.
You had the feeling it was
An ill-posed problem. Well, the idea of ill-posed problems I learned from Beers.
Were you concerned about working on a problem when there was so little theory of mixed-type equations?
There was very little theory, but there was the work of Tricomi, who had been doing that some years before. I certainly relied a lot on what Tricomi had done in order to move forward, and then that's when the whole business of the multipliers came up. It came up in mixed equations.
Your work on the shock-free transonic flow came first, though, right?
Well, it's connected. It's connected.
Was Garabedian at Courant at that time with his shock-free airfoils?
He came later. That's right.
So he hadn't done his work with complex.
Oh, it was a complex continuation. He did that while he was still in California.
Uh-huh. I remember Tony Jameson computing the
That's right.
shock-free airfoil and then perturbing the Mach number by like 1% and showing your result how a shock
I see.
developed. And he was waving his graphics around the lounge and showing people how
Yeah, I remember
the
that
proof,
too.
of your
The
result
pudding.
in his graphics. Yeah.
No, certainly Beers created a different atmosphere. And then, of course, Garabedian came. He left Berkeley to go to Stanford because of the loyalty oath.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then he was annoyed about something at Stanford. Stoker heard about it. He went out there. He offered him a job without consulting anybody. So then there were people who never warmed up to Garabedian because he hadn't gone through the due process.
Well, then, how did you get started on the Morowitz multiplier?
Well, that came from Joe Keller. Sometime after I was back, Joe was invited to give a talk on open problems. And so he discussed maybe 6 or 7 problems, and I was amazed to discover that there were certain things about the wave equation that had never been worked out. And so after that lecture, I had been using multipliers for mixed equations, so then I tried multipliers on the wave equation, and in 3 days, I remember it's the fastest result I ever got, I could answer one of Joe's questions. And I was very pleased about that. And then I worked in that area for some time.
Do you have a favorite piece of work of yours?
Getting estimates for the wave equation, that was sort of surprisingly easy. And so in a way, it's a favorite. That's right. Mm-hmm. Oh, but actually, the one I like best is the exponential decay of solutions in 3 dimensions.
Your nonlinear scattering results with Walter Strauss?
Oh, they're limited in how nonlinear they are, so that's their shortcoming.
Well, how did that collaboration come about?
Walter was a refugee from Germany, and his parents were refugees living in Queens. So Walter used to come down to New York in order to visit his parents. And so he would make it official by visiting the Courant Institute. So we got talking and we got started working together. That's how it came about. I liked problems that came out of physics. And that's what applied mathematics really was when I was young. And later, today, it absorbs a lot of biology, about which I know nothing.
But you then went on to explore new things that you...
Well, the other area that I really worked on was scattering theory, and that was inspired by a lecture of Joe Keller's. I remember sitting there. I had worked on mixed equations, that is, those that were in some regions hyperbolic and in some regions elliptic. And I was sitting there listening to Joe talk. I thought, oh, well, you could look at the wave equation. In time, it's hyperbolic, and in space, it's elliptic. And then I went, after that lecture, and I started fooling around, and I came up with some crucial identities within a few days. That's the only time I ever did anything fast. Eventually, the main result was also proved by Lax and Phillips in a fancier way, but mine was quite direct, and that was that the energy, if you make a disturbance around a certain class of objects, being star-shaped, for example, is sufficient, that then the energy decays exponentially in any finite sphere.
From a shock?
No, this is all linear. Linear.
Okay.
So it's from a disturbance,
Okay.
from a local disturbance. And so that was the essence of the scattering theory.
Have you been involved with seeing the physical results of your theories?
No, but of course I also worked for many years on Howard Grad's big contract. There I was concerned about so-called collisionless shocks. One of the ideas in fusion had been that you would heat up a plasma with a big shock, and the question is, how could you do it? Because the mean free path was very long, and so the shock would be very long too. So that consumed a lot of me. I worked a lot on that for a long time, partial resolution. So those were the 3 areas that I mostly worked in: transonic flow, scattering theory, and plasma physics.
And you've won several prizes for your work in those fields, yes. And work continues today in those areas.
Yes, but I'm a little bit out of it.
But I mean, your work is still cited, your work is still mentioned.
That's true.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Can you tell me about, in your early work, your interaction with Hermann Weyl?
Well, I had a very limited reaction with Hermann Weyl. But what happened was that Courant asked me to fix up a paper or finish it off or edit it. And it was by Weyl, but I knew 2 Weyls. There was Joe Weyl and Hermann Weyl. I didn't know their first names, and I just assumed the paper was by the younger, less known one, and that I could monkey with it any way I liked. And so I did what I was supposed to do, and then I went down to Princeton And when the real Hermann Weyl appeared, I was sort of very much taken aback, and I was somewhat embarrassed to be correcting his English. And the problem really was that Hermann Weyl actually liked to use what I would call a florid style, a little overdone, and I had taken that all out. So we put it back in. And that was the only time I ever met. At the end of the session, he took me down to tea. I think he thought he was going to impress me with that, but that didn't impress me so much. But it was all very uncomfortable. I didn't really like doing that job.
You're still working on something now.
From time to time, let's say, I work on, and the equation I'm working on is y times the Laplacian plus lambda u in the upper half plane. And how did I get into that? I don't know. I can't remember. And every time now and then I pull it out. I have found some identities and inequalities for that equation, but I haven't published anything about it. The last thing had to do with, usually in mixed equations, you looked at domains which had a gap in the hyperbolic boundary where nothing was imposed. In this case, you're looking at a Dirichlet problem for a closed boundary, part of which is in the hyperbolic side. And it involved slightly different methods. Somewhere along the line, I invented a maximum principle for a Tricomi-like equation. And so that's sort of probably the last thing I did or will do.
Can we call it the Morowitz maximum principle so we have the alliteration again?
Well, it's my maximum principle. That's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a slightly different question. With the role of computation in some of your results, there's the work on solitons, where there was a little bit of computing.
That came out of magnetohydrodynamics. Yeah.
How did you get involved in that?
I was for many years at least partially supported by Harold Grad's group. So problems about solitons were connected to plasmas, so that was a legitimate connection.
Well, also, computation may have played a role in your work on von Neumann reflection. I remember looking with you at to look if there was a Mach stem at certain angles.
I didn't do the computations myself, though they were done by Tony Wolff, who worked at the Cornell Institute.
Any thoughts on the role of
computation? Well, it's very important for finding out things, and where you don't know what you don't know what the theorem ought to be, so you compute. But I never did much computing myself. As a programmer, I think I was a dud.
What about thoughts on the role on the pure versus applied life at Courant or in the field?
Well, of course, my degree from Toronto was in applied mathematics. And so I've always thought of myself as an applied mathematician. But if I look back, I can see that some results are purer than others. So. such as theorems about mixed equations. My favorite paper, I've already said one, but maybe I can have another one, is a paper on exponential decay of solutions of the wave equation, where I broke it up and showed how there's a piece going out. At every instant of time, you can take out a piece. Then you go forward in time, take out another piece. And then it's very easy, actually, to expect and to prove exponential decay.
So you think this separation of pure versus applied math is...
Well, since I'm confined to PDEs, I can't comment. I don't think I ever wrote a paper in pure math that wasn't a PDE paper.
I guess what I'm asking is, some people try to divide them, whereas sort of the attitude of Courant is more the unity.
Yeah, well, the unity, Courant was very strong on the unity. I think that should be on his gravestone.
It certainly seems to be in your work, too,
Yeah.
from both.
Oh, yes. The unity of mathematics, pure and applied.
And computational.
Computation is a part of the applied.
Okay.
The terms pure mathematician and applied mathematician don't have precise definitions.
That's true.
People still use them, but other people tend to feel that they've outlived their usefulness, those categories, and that mathematics is broad and coming together. This is a discussion in the field. What do you feel about it?
I think a number theorist, well, actually number theory is a funny area. I think that it's kind of applied. But if you take algebra, that's pure mathematics. There's no question about
What
that.
what does that mean? How do you see
A person who
pure
calls
mathematics?
themselves an algebraist does algebra.
Yes, but how is that different from a person who does analysis or a person
Well-
who solves partial differential equations?
Oh, that's too complicated.
Ah, okay.
That doesn't have an easy answer, but I would say a person is what they think they are.
Do you think it's helpful to want mathematicians to be more broadly trained today?
One can't really answer those questions, that kind of question, because we don't really know. We'll have to see what develops. Partly if some of the applications turn out to be extraordinarily useful. I mean, certainly the invention of the atomic bomb did a lot for mathematics, and there'll be other things.
One of the issues that sometimes people who were trained in an
Yeah.
earlier time have strong feelings about is the education of mathematicians today and how this should be. I have no idea if you have strong feelings about this or not.
I guess I would always plug that there should be some element of applied mathematics in their education, but it's very hard to say.
Well, I think all the fields are bigger than they were before. I think that's the expansion of knowledge, and it's hard to keep up.
Knowledge expands, but at the same time there are contracting influences. They bring themselves together. So I don't really know.
Have you been involved at all in some of the controversies about mathematics at lower grade levels in the United States?
No.
Okay, because it might have affected your grandchildren, for example.
Or even my children.
Or even your children.
Yeah. But I was never involved in that. That's-
Probably just as well. It's a very contentious topic.
I went to some parent-teacher meeting when one of my children was in junior high school, and I was so appalled at the way that the parents treated the teachers that I never went again.
I see. So you didn't have the experience that you felt their mathematics wasn't being taught adequately or that they weren't.
No, I just felt that they were so mean to the teachers. who were up against a lot of things. In particular, this was New York City, they didn't have books, so the teachers had bought books, and the parents were complaining that they didn't give the children the books. It was just outrageous. So I never went again.
After you became a faculty member at Courant, you were gradually drawn into administration. How did that come about?
It was a device to reduce my teaching load. Who brought it about, I don't know, but it worked. And I quite liked administering things, grants for people, and stuff like that.
So
I guess in fact, at some point there was a division of the Institute which was mainly supported by a great big Navy contract. And so I wrote the reports for that and sent them in and got reports from people and consolidated them, and I got off one course.
Well, you must have been good at it.
I've always gotten along pretty well with people. So I never, for example, bawled somebody out for not doing something or anything like that. And so it all fitted in quite nicely.
You became chair of the math department.
Well, that was a funny job. Henry McCain and I traded positions.
At some point, you became deputy director, and then you had a famous turn as director, the first woman to run a math institute.
I came over the years to understand that if a woman wants to cry in a certain situation, she should damn well go ahead and do that. But when I got into tight situations and I wanted to cry, I couldn't. I felt I couldn't. I felt that would be terribly destructive. I understand that the attitude among women, feminists, has completely changed on that subject.
Were there a lot of such episodes where you felt?
No, not a lot, but once or twice, maybe 3 times or so. I remember leaving the Institute and walking actually up to Columbus Circle in order to steady myself.
What kind of things would drive you crazy like this?
Usually the ridiculous behavior of my colleagues. That's the worst thing about being a female administrator.
Well, you know how they say if there's a group of people sitting around a table, they won't hear the woman's voice. The woman will say something, nobody listens. 10 minutes later, the guy says something, everyone says, oh yeah, great, let's do that, great idea.
There were very few women around, so doing those things, so I had, I remember, however, once Julia Robinson was the first woman president of the Math Society. I met her once in the bathroom and she was in tears. And so I felt very sorry for her. And I formulated then to myself that, if you want to cry, cry. But I never actually cried in front of my colleagues. I walked out once or twice.
Well, were there particular things that you were happy about when you were director?
I quite liked running things. That was fine. And I had a very nice relationship with Henry. I think it began that we alternated between being chairman of the department and being deputy director, something like that. Anyway.
So Henry was deputy director when you were director? Or?
No, it was more at the next level. We were alternating.
Okay, so he was chair of the math department,
yeah,
and
that's
you were...
right. Yeah, something like that. And he's a great guy to work with.
Was there something you were working towards as some kind of something you wanted to accomplish?
First of all, the Heights was sold. And so the people from the Heights, I don't think I was the director at that time. I think Louis was the director. But they had to be absorbed into the faculty. So there were all sorts of problems connected with that. Nobody wanted them. It meant we couldn't make any appointments at what we considered was the institute level. So it was, those were difficult times.
Also, the computer science department was just.
I had lots of rows about that, and I guess I didn't want to see a computer science department. I wanted to keep it all as one. However, I got defeated in that. And how? I didn't cry over it, though.
Okay, so that was one of the difficult parts of
Yeah.
being director.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But overall, you enjoyed.
Yeah, overall I enjoyed it, and at that time also you participated in the central administration, so, and I liked that too. I thought that was a good thing for the Institute.
How long was your term?
Whatever the minimum was, because at the end of it I wanted out.
What can you tell me about what it was like at Courant during the McCarthy era?
Well, we were rather close to it because Flanders' brother was a senator, and he was the senator that turned on McCarthy. So by the time that actually happened, we were all cheering. Now, Courant went several times to Washington. I think he gave testimony to the Un-American activities, but he had a wonderful way of double talk, which and mumbling over things, and I think, and he helped, definitely helped some people very much. Now, there was some guy who was head of the Bureau of Standards, and he came under fire. Aston was his name, yes. And I remember going to Courant's house when it was all over, and he opened the door, and it had been settled. I think we didn't know that. And he said, everything is all right. We no longer have to pretend that Aston is a great scientist. And that was a very typical Courantism. I think Aston was actually a perfectly good scientist for the job that he had. It was administering the Bureau of Standards.
The one we didn't discuss, because it's not leadership in the sciences, is being a trustee at Princeton. Can you comment about that?
I think I can tell a nice story about that. When my term as a trustee was up, I was still on the math department committee. But I felt I had enough and I wanted to quit. So I mentioned this to Jürgen, who was still around, Jürgen Moser, and he said, no, you can't quit yet. And I said, why? He said, no, you've got to get Kruskal into the math department. And so I did that, and I followed his advice.
Now, how did you do that?
Well, Kruskal was in the astrophysics at the time, and Kruskal was a person with lots of ideas. He was a very good mathematician. He should have been in the math department, but he was also a difficult person. I guess I just sat on committees, and eventually they saw that he belonged in the math department. I think when he came to faculty meeting, there was a certain feeling he talked too much, but it was the right thing to do.
Do you think your advocacy helped
Yeah,
make this happen?
Yeah, I felt I played a role
By,
by talking to people and pointing out his great achievements,
I
and
see.
that it would be damaging for mathematics to have been so stupid as to leave him out.
How did you become a trustee at Princeton?
Well, I became a trustee because they had two women trustees, neither of whom were professionals, and they thought they should have a woman trustee who was a professional, and they claimed they looked in the files and decided on the mother of Nancy Moravitz. I'm not quite sure that that's how it happened, but anyway, that's the story I was told.
And the board was composed of which people, the board of trustees? What kinds of
Well,
people?
there was a mix. There were always certain. I'm still sometimes in contact with Frist, who was a graduate. I think a recent graduate, and then there were these other women, and then there were. Basically, of course, you were in transition from a state in which all the trustees had been donors, I would say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And did you feel you had a real role to play in running the university?
No.
I see.
I remember at every stage I always thought the power must lie in some level above me. But I actually was eventually in the highest level of administration that fell to the trustees, and the power didn't lie there either. So I don't know. I never quite figured it out. The chairman of the board and the president, who was Bill Bowen, were really the people who ran the university.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel there were some general lessons that you learned from being on the Princeton board that you applied when you were AMS president?
No.
Where the power lay in your hands?
I never felt that the AMS president had a lot of power.
Okay. You should know.
At some point, you were elected president of the AMS.
That's true. I was very close to 70. And of course, when I hit 70, they still required you had to retire. So that's why I retired at 70, and that is now almost 20 years ago. So
that was the last year.
The last
I remember
year,
that it was law that you had to retire.
But it didn't bother me. I was quite happy about it. And the funny thing is, the other person who had to retire at the same time was Harold Shapiro. Hadn't worked a proper job at the Courant Institute for years, and he was very annoyed that he had to retire.
You had more time to spend on the things you really wanted to do.
That's right, yeah.
How did becoming president of the AMS become one of the things that you did?
Well, first I was a vice president.
Okay, you had to agree to run for that office.
That's right. And since the vice president really had no duties, I remember inquiring about that. I thought I might as well run for that. And then when I was a vice president, they asked me if I'd be willing to be a president.
Well, between being the first woman director at Courant and then the second woman president of the AMS, your publicity file must be quite full.
I remember only one occasion what made me sort of unhappy as the president. There was somebody who wouldn't shut up. And I remember having to sort of stand up and say, sit down and shut up. I don't think I used the word shut up. Sit down and be quiet.
So you could make yourself heard.
I could make myself heard.
Well, I remember moving into the office next door to you, right around that time that you became president, and Margaret Wright was president of
Oh, that's
SIAM
right.
at the
That was
time.
very
So
nice.
both societies, both mathematical societies had female presidents. And she would come in and have lunch with you maybe once a month,
Yeah, that's
if,
right.
if
We
I'm
would do
remembering
that.
correctly,
Yeah.
and I was so impressed.
That's good.
Did you have, did SIAM and the AMS have special relationships during that time?
Siam was regarded by the more pure math community as a bit of an upstart. And on the other hand, Siam regarded the Math Society as pretty stuffy. So, that had to be, that sort of got ironed out when Margaret and I were functioning.
Is that when you first met, or you knew each other before?
Well, Margaret was at Bell Labs, and I think I knew her then, or had met her. I don't think I really knew her. I got to know her much better later.
Let me ask you about all the prizes. You've won a number of wonderful prizes. Is there one that is especially dear to you?
I think the Burkhoff Prize of the math, which is joint, I think, the math and Siam, or is it a Siam prize?
It's a
joint prize.
Joint prize.
Oh, that one pleased me very much. As a girl, I heard about Burkhoff Sr., who was a professor at Harvard, and who amused my mother very much by once getting sort of excited and saying, well, strike me pink. So I always remembered that about Burkhoff. So I felt
That's a great expression.
it was wonderful to get his prize. And that was really, in many ways, the most important prize. Now, getting the Medal of Science was very nice, too, but it was given to me by Clinton. And, of course, I didn't know at the time that Clinton was in some serious trouble at the end of his presidency. And it was all, I guess what happened was the woman who got the prize before me, he knew, and they embraced and had a big chat together on the podium. And when I came up, they had to make up for time, so it was a quick handshake and be gone.
No.
So I was disappointed. But at any rate, it didn't really matter. I still have the medal.
Well, I remember when Courant threw a party for you when you got the national medal. It's one of my favorite kinds of things that Courant does, is part of the celebrations they have for when someone wins an award and how everyone turns out. And I remember very clearly you giving a speech, and your 2-year-old granddaughter was dancing around your feet while you were giving your speech and thanking all the people who were important to you and the influences. And I thought, this is really a woman who's had it all. This is so impressive.
I do remember that. And of course, it must have been Alicia, my older granddaughter. I had first 4 grandsons, and then she was the first granddaughter. And it's very nice now. She and her sister live near us, so we see them a lot.
Do you feel like you've been able to have it all?
Well, I guess, frankly, life has not been without its troubles, but I really, professionally and as a mathematician, I've had a very good time.
What about when you were elected to the National Academy? A great milestone. Hardly any women.
Well, there weren't so many women. Well, it came up with me because I wasn't sure what section to go into. the section where the mathematicians are or the section where the applied mathematicians were. And what I was looking for was where I would have the most influence. And in the end, I think I went into the applied math, much smaller and more reasonable. And but they changed the rules, and you can now belong to several sections. And I think that happened after I was elected, and then I also operate in Section 11.
So you decided to go with applied math.
Yeah, I felt that's where I belong. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Looking back, what influences do you think were the most important to you that allowed you to become such a trendsetter and do so many firsts?
Well, of course, I always said about my father's attitude was that women could do anything men could do if they would just give up the silly things like worrying about their clothes and things like that. I don't think he said it all the time, but certainly that was what he thought, and so that influenced me a lot. I was also very influenced by the fact that I think my mother would have liked to have had a career and couldn't, for various reasons. The wrong time in life, and she didn't finish college. She quit college in order to support herself and my father. That was a big influence. My mother's interest in seeing that I had a career. I mean, my older sister was an architect. My younger sister did not have a career, and almost in defiance. Well, she studied piano, and then when it turned out she wasn't going to be a genius at the piano, she gave it up.
It's often said that the two things that are the most important are the role models and the mentor.
Who were the role models and who were the mentors? I don't know.
Well, your parents.
Well, my parents had a big influence on me. But my father even wrote somewhere, I think, that he didn't think I should become a mathematician because we might fight like the Bernoulli brothers. Now, it turns out there were a whole lot of Bernoullis, and they didn't all fight, but it is true that some of them did.
Just talking today, you've mentioned a few stumbling blocks, faculty that were perhaps less than supportive when you were pregnant, or an episode of sexual harassment in college, and so on. But
well, the sexual harassment in college amounted to nothing because the perpetrator realized that I was the daughter of his fellow faculty member, and he stopped immediately. So then I found out that was a certain advantage in having my father as my father.
Were there any difficulties in having another mathematician in the family?
Well, my father thought we might fight. We never did. We never worked on the same problem. I think there was once, when he was very old, there was some talk of having a joint paper, but it didn't come to pass, no.
You've continued to go back to Ireland a lot, and you still have family. Your dad went back.
Well, my father went back, and I have no first cousins left, but I have second cousins in Ireland, so it's nice to go, and they're nice people. So.
Well, you were just there 2 weeks ago.
I was just there. Well, then I went for something else. There was a symposium in honor of my father's older brother. Now, he inherited, when J.M. Singh, the author, died, he left his estate half to that nephew and half to another nephew who's more remote from me. So Hachi, this one, inherited that money and could therefore live an independent life, which he spent actually with his parents. And he went on the continent and he tried his hand at being a dramatist, and that didn't work out. And then he came back to Ireland and he was depressed, and my father suggested to him that he should write up his papers. And my grandfather had been a school friend of Joly, who was the leading physicist in Ireland at the time. So he arranged for them to be published in Phil Mag. And they're pearls. They are really amazing papers. And here was a symposium, he's long dead, and in his honor in Ireland. So of course I had to go. And so it was remarkable.
What kind of pearls?
Well, he worked on optical problems. He devised a multiple mirror telescope, which actually was built in Arizona maybe 20 years ago. And he also built a thing for seeing with a modification of a microscope, things whose length was less than the wavelength of light. So they were inventions. So he just had those 6 papers, and unfortunately, he died insane. And so the last 20 years of his life, he lived in an institution. I think it was a fairly comfortable institution. I don't think he suffered there particularly. He was allowed out. He could go for walks in Dublin. In fact, on one occasion, he took a train up to Belfast and went to visit some relatives there, but then somebody in Dublin sent and got him. So he was an unusual person, and I was delighted that there was a symposium in his honor, so I couldn't miss that. So that's why I went to Ireland.
Well, so you really have a kind of mathematical and scientifically oriented family history.
Yeah, well, except that the family history is dominated by the great uncle who wrote the play.
Except for the famous great uncle. So tell us about him.
Well, he died around 1908, so my father never knew him. Hachi actually did know him, and he wrote about 9 plays, and he died, he must have been in his late 30s, from cancer growing on his neck that they didn't know how to treat. So it was a tragedy. He should have gone on in life. And he's still one of the leading Irish playwrights. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. And what else can I say about him? He also wrote poetry, but the poetry isn't that good. But the plays are great. And of course, my sister was called Pegeen, and my daughter is called Pegeen, and that's the name of his heroine.
Your middle name, your now middle name, your maiden name, is that of a very distinguished Irish family, yes?
Well,
has that affected you?
Oh,
the fact that people say, did your father write Playboy of the Western World, for example?
Of course it affected me, but mainly when we were children, that there was a kind of, we were sings and we had to behave better than most people. There was a lot of that.
Your parents
I guess
told
there's
you
a
that.
lot of that in all families in different forms, but there was a lot of that.
It's a very famous name, though.
It's an old name. The Sings were given their name by Henry VIII. It was given to a singer, so it really means sing.
Oh.
It was spelled S-Y-N-G-E because that's the way they spelled it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The Sings came to Ireland at the end of the 17th century, One of them was a representative in the Irish Parliament. The Irish had their own parliament, and the English wanted to unite them, so that was an issue. And this ancestor voted in favor of union with Britain, and as a result of that, he was awarded a large estate. Maybe that was coincidental, but it's quite a
By
coincidence.
the English.
By the English.
Yes.
So he had that large estate. So during the 19th century, that was the center for the Singhs. And but they were steadily losing money all the time, so they became much less wealthy. But the other thing is that some of them came as bishops in the Church of Ireland. You see, in a large part of the 19th century, Catholicism was outlawed, and the established church was the Church of Ireland, which was a counterpart of the Anglican Church. And the Singhs were bishops in the Church of Ireland. So the first one was Archbishop of Tuam. So I went there to see what it was like. It's an ordinary church. And they stayed in clerical positions until the 19th century.
And the playwright?
The playwright was I guess his uncle had inherited the castle and so on, so that was how he was not brought up there. His mother was a widow, and his grandfather on the other side was one of the translators of Josephus. I understand that was a common practice to translate Josephus. So,
How did your father then come to move to Canada?
oh, well, my father was a younger son of a second son, so he moved to Canada because some Canadian mathematician by the name of Delury came to Ireland at the end of the First World War, and met him, and was very intrigued by the fact that he was a Singh, and offered him a job as an assistant professor. And he was just 22 or something. He'd been a very good undergraduate student, so he went, but he had married, and so they decided to go to Canada. So he went to Canada in 1920 or 19, I'm not quite sure. I think it was 19.
That seems like a very bold step.
It was, but he wasn't that attached to his own family, and so he was quite ready to be independent.
You yourself, though, have established connections with Ireland, right? I mean,
Well, I have two second cousins there.
but you're in the Irish Academy, are you not? And advised.
That's right. Yes, they.
So
elected.
they've recognized your connection with Ireland.
Well, I think that's true.
We were talking about your parents as role models for your scientific career. Was it ever a negative to have a father who knew people he would arrange for with Courant, for example?
I see.
He went behind your back, or was it only
No.
positive?
I think it was mainly positive. He was very restrained. He would never ask for he never asked for an embarrassing favor. But we never really talked mathematics. Our fields didn't really overlap. And
What was your father's field?
well, he worked in relativity, especially he wrote a book, several books on relativity, and I really don't know anything about relativity.
You have encouragement from your parents, even if,
Yeah,
despite the
I think
fighting
so. Yeah, I think so.
potential.
Yeah.
And you had the professor at Toronto that you mentioned who helped you get a scholarship
Yeah.
for a PhD. So would you say that, and then Courant himself?
Yeah, Courant himself was tremendously helpful to me. I mean, essentially, when I had another child, he sort of said, "Well, how much more money do you need?" And it wasn't quite like that, but he had in mind I was being paid so I could pay somebody to take care of the children and the house and so on.
Well, some of the things you just mentioned now, like going to the Congress and finding a nursery school to put your children in, these are still important issues that make it really tough.
The last year of my thesis, I found it very difficult. I had a small baby and second child, and it was I didn't have good help, and so that was hard, and I was afraid I would have to give up. I mean, I didn't, and I struggled along, but it never occurred to me just to take a term off and reorganize my life and then go on.
I don't think it occurred to many people for many years.
The advent of Betty Friedan figured in my life because I had always been a feminist, but my older sister, who was an architect, read Betty Friedan, and it was an eye-opener to her, and that surprised me.
So would you say you ran into other difficulties?
No, once I got into the atmosphere around Courant, there was a very positive attitude. You know, Courant had been the supporter of Emmy Noether back in Göttingen years before. And so the idea of a woman having a profession was certainly accepted all around the Courant Institute. Not among my neighbors in Fanwood, New Jersey, but I didn't really care about that.
Well, it sounds like you ran into less difficulty than I did.
It's quite possible. It's quite possible, but you'll have to tell me about your difficulties.
Well, what do you think the situation is now?
Today? Well, of course, I have 3 daughters, and my oldest daughter she's hiring personnel at a high level for Chanel. I think that's who she's working for. Yeah, that's right. And so she's a professional woman, but she's in her early 60s, and she works only maybe 3 days a week. And my second child is a son who works for a union, and the third child is Lida, who's a psychiatric. She's a psychiatrist, but she's a psychoanalytic psychiatrist. And the fourth one is Nancy, who's a professor of law at NYU. And her field is immigration law.
Well, they have you as their role model.
I hope so.
Is it fair to say that Richard Courant was the biggest single influence on the early part of your career? I know there were many from what you've said.
Well, it would be divided with Friedrichs.
Mm-hmm.
Friedrich certainly gave me problems, and I worked on lots of things with Friedrichs, and was much influenced by his demand for rigor.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to go from Courant to Friedrichs, and they used to meet together in New Rochelle, but I lived in New Jersey, so we didn't meet all 3 together. I would take something to Friedrichs, and Friedrichs would be very unhappy because it was no longer accurate. And then I would take Friedrich's thing, I'd fix up the English, and then I'd go to Courant, and Courant would say, "Oh, it's impossibly dull," and he'd rewrite it. So I went back and forth like that, and that's how I got to know them so well.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Garabedian, I influenced him and he influenced me. I think he became interested in transonic flow through looking at my work. And before that, he'd done the work on the detached shock out in front of the supersonic missile or what have you. And then with the transonic, it has its own problems, and he found that. And he did a lot of very important computations, designing wings. That was definitely connected to my work.